All right, in chapter 25, we're going to take a look at the Baroque in Northern Europe. We talked about Spain in the last, and um, we're gonna start in the area of Flanders that we've mentioned before, and really take a look at Peter Paul Rubens. Rubens is just a enigmatic artist. I implore you, there's a film on Canopy that includes him and Caravaggio in it, and the YouTube link here also just gives you even more depth into his work and what he's able to accomplish. And I mean, tons and tons of his work exists still. He painted with oils, and that was the primary choice of painters at the time anyway, but he was all through oils. And he's working when Spanish Netherlands still existed. And so there's this influence by the Baroque of the Catholic Church. And so he's kind of considered what they call like a pan-European style, where he's using all these techniques, right? So many have traveled and learned from each other that now we have techniques from Italy, Spain, Flanders, all over in European work. And he achieved international fame with it. He had many royal patrons, he was very educated, and he had a lot of assistants. And so what that shows is that, the assistants painted a lot of the work, and then he would come back in and touch up where, his like on the figures themselves. So you'd have assistants paint the background, some of the flags or maybe even the animals and stuff. You may even have some assistants paint some of this, but the main characters then he would paint in. And interesting enough, that's still a technique that's used today by painters. So there's a lot of mainstream painters that will do that. He was also an art dealer, so he's buying and selling works, and because of this, he was very rich. This one that he showed up, or that I'm showing here, he did when he was 23 years old, and so it just kind of shows you, what this person was capable of. But he did study in Italy. I painted this for a church in Antwerp, and it is an altarpiece. They were commissioned by the churches to show their allegiance with the Catholic Church and not Protestants. Protestant churches wouldn't have these. So, now you're seeing art being used very politically. And you can see a lot of his influences of Michelangelo and Caravaggio in this work. His dramatic foreshortening and anatomy is sort of like a synthesis of everything that you can imagine being that we've seen before, right? We can see even that triangular movement, but now it's shifted, and so now we see Christ back in space, and we see all these muscular figures, pulling him upwards, and so it's pretty amazing. Through all his work, you're going to see the human body in action, and how it works. To continue on another work of propaganda like this, it shows the authority and the right to rule, as we have the Queen of another Medici who's coming off the ship, and having him higher in space, between lower in space, showing them their riches and their glory, and they're almost like, everyone welcoming arms, even the trumpets sound their arrival from angelic beings, right? So it shows that authority, to right to rule, right? The upper class that are born versus the lower classes, or those who even try to rise to upper class, right? It's still not high enough for him. Marie de Medici is the widow of Henry IV, and she commissioned Rubens to do this to glorify his career, but however, she's sort of the center of it. It is 13 feet tall, and everything in the work really is like rejoicing of her. Just to show some other work that not everything was about, the figure, the daily life, and even some landscapes. Now all of a sudden we're seeing still lifes, and still lifes become popular. You can look at them, and for the most part they were always used as a study. And you can look at these and say, wow, they're really beautiful. But they really weren't taken seriously until this era, right? And Clara Peters and her work became highly regarded amongst her peers for her talents, right? And showing the surface textures to where these things look almost edible. I mean, just a master of them. So talking a little bit about the Dutch Republic, just a little bit of map of where we're at, and we've talked a lot about this area already, but the Dutch specifically, um, this was the financial capital of the continent in the 17th century, right? They were experts at trade between Japan, Africa, South America. So you can imagine knowing that and having all these ports that they are making some money. And in there, portraits become even a higher demand as people try to prove their status and their wealth. Here's a work by Judith Leister, a self-portrait, but she would also paint portraits. And these being in demand, and also sort of the openness, or you're seeing women that are able to sustain careers. You can see that training and emphasis for her that she's able to be a career artist, right? She is painting a portrait, she herself. She's not the portrait sitter, but here's the palette in hand. So all that proof happens in these portraits. So they become very, very symbolic. And, even shows her nice clothing, right? To say that I can afford this, or her status. So, when you think of portraits, they begin to use them that way to show their titles. And here we see probably the most famous of the Dutch painters in Rembrandt van Rijn. And one of his earlier works, The Anatomy Lesson. And, it's quite interesting. We still see sort of that triangular framework. Right? We have sort of the spotlighting, the theatrical that seems very Baroque, so it's Master of Light. But we actually see the cadaver in the hand being taken apart, right, and seeing each individual muscles and tendons, and not only does it document, but what's kind of funny about this is that Rembrandt was approached and said, I want a portrait, and somebody else wanted a portrait, and somebody else wanted a portrait. So he got them all together because they happened to be in the same field, and so he did a group portrait. So he painted one painting of all of them and charged them all. But anyway, he was popular enough to get away with it. But what's fairly new is the idea that he can show a dissection. This isn't very common. The dead usually had a different sort of reference, and so to be able to actually display that they are working from cadavers shows you a little bit of what's going on for the time and the way they must be thinking about the human body. He began painting when he was 26, and which it's kind of later in life, even though it seems kind of young. But but from there gained massive popularity, and was pretty rich for a while. Another one of his pieces that is almost like a group portrait, because he even painted himself right there. That face behind the shoulder is Rembrandt himself, but it's called The Night Watch. And in here we have another sort of group portrait, and that theatrical setting, right? Even the sort of lines that bring you right to the individuals. But he was able to make his living off of his portraits in this work. But then his wife died, and he was very much about his wife. And when she died, he kind of fell into depression, never really rebounded, and died a pauper, really, a blind pauper at that. Since he did paint by candlelight, it did deteriorate. But there was some freedom in that, while he was going blind and stuff. He was painting many self-portraits, and his style and the way he used paint and specific colors is still studied today. Also, printmaker. This is known as the 100 Gilter print because that's how much it costs. And it's a etching and engraving, so he was combining some of the printmaking methods here. He wasn't looking at it strictly as a medium to gain money. He was looking at what it could express for him. And so he was even putting ink into the plate, and instead of wiping some of it away in the lines, he was just like dabbing it in there and then printing it. And so he became quite the printmaker. If you've ever seen the movie with Scarlett Johansson called The Girl with the Pearl Earring, you probably know a little bit about Vermeer. And Vermeer, he was what we can call an interior scene painter. He had a lot of patrons that came from the middle class that are able to get that money, but he was mostly an innkeeper and an art dealer. So we don't have a whole lot of his paintings. Only 35 paintings are attributed to him. When we think of something like Rembrandt, he's got 500 drawings, several hundred prints. So his life his artistic life is very small. But he was Catholic and converted to Protestant, and he didn't paint religious scenes because of this, right? Like the idea that image is sacred. A woman is just a symbol of justice, and behind her is a work about the Last Judgment. So she's almost like Christ's winged soul. So a lot of people see, the balance of the scales, like Lady Justice, and then behind here they have a work by Titian, and it's a copy of that Last Judgment. So there may be some symbolism going on there. The symbols in this work are in the golden pearls as references sins and vanity that are on the table. He used a tool called camera obscura, and so basically he's able to set the viewer in front of a light source, and by putting yourself in sort of a dark box with a little tiny pinhole, it will project that image, right? This is how our cameras work. This is how our eyes work. And that image will actually be projected upside down unless you get a lens for it and stuff. So, but you're then able to project it onto a surface and trace out what you need, and even then start painting in there to match colors. So he used a lot of shadows with his color, and most before him had like colorless shadows, right? They would just be blacks. But in here, instead of black, right, he would use maybe even a deep brown or a darker purple and stuff like that. So he's the one who really was a studier of light. He used a lot of reflected light and color in his work. And I think his observations really helped push other artists forward, whether he knew what he was doing at the time or not, if he was just copying. But he put it in his work. And so they got to see what was actually happening with light on an actual surface. Some believe, though, that the lens that he used on his camera obscura was a little out of focus. So there's always a little bit of blur to these. But anyway, and just to give you a little bit of an idea of what that camera obscura would be like, right? The artist, the subject would be standing here, the light and everything. But if you're in that dark box with a little hole, it would project onto that canvas, and you can see the sitter being upside down, and you can trace that. His model looked a little bit more like this, where you could put the viewer in this, and as they came to this lens, this would project onto your paper canvas, and then you would be able to draw. So really you were limited in size, but it's the first projectors, first cameras. All right, as we talked about, as still life was growing popular, it showed really the goods and accumulation of wealth from around the world. So we have a bunch of objects, including even the skull of Memento Mori, but we see those distributed around. Sometimes the patron of the work, instead of wanting a portrait, they would just ask for one of these that says, look at all these goods that I've gotten from everywhere. In France, France is not rich during this period as the Dutch, but they are the most powerful country during the 17th century. The power needed for images then, flourished. So in painting, the king was the biggest patron, King Louis here. If you looked at this and you had to sort of guess, what is it that he's wanting you to take a look at the most, would probably be his legs. And it's true, he loved his legs. He thought they were beautiful and that of a dancer, and so a lot of his pieces were showing off his legs. But the king wanted, his image and other images spread across the country, and so he became really a master of propaganda. He believed it was his divine right to rule, so he needed lots of images of himself everywhere. He called himself the Sun King because all planets have to rotate around the sun. He had a workshop of artists always creating, and the artists had to face to everything but the face. What's really kind of interesting is that when there was a workshop, they would do everything but the face, and then the actual would paint it on. And this one, they actually took they painted on a piece of paper and stuck it on. So it's kind of interesting that there's paper attached to the canvas there with his face painted on it. As I said before, he was a dancer. He was a ballet dancer in his youth. And here we also notice how the king is sort of looking down at the viewer. This was painted as a gift for the king's grandson, but he loved it so much that he kept it. And then he had the work copied, many times to distribute. So some, though, there's some newer news on this and that say this is also the beginning of wigs and powdered wigs. There's some belief that King Louis started losing his hair early in life because of syphilis, that being one of the side effects. So this shows this early style. We hadn't seen this style of hair and wig before, so he's wearing that because maybe he's suffering from syphilis. But then because the king's wearing it, then everybody else thinks it's cool too, so they start wearing them. Classicism started to come back again, and France being interested in it, they drove artists, they wanted them to study in Italy, right? So they were sending their artists there and then coming back. And so here's an example by Poussin, how he did that. And there's a lot of allegory in this. And Poussin wrote a treatise about painting that he never finished, but in it he talked a lot about the grand manner style. And so this became a term that referenced not only his work, but this style of work, which is a focus on everything needs to be grand. That subjects should be about battles and heroics and rooted in the classical world. He really revealed Raphael, and his work emulates that a lot. In fact, the figures come from the sculpture of Neptune, and surprisingly enough, the woman on the right represents death. These three sort of shepherds that have come across this stone or this tomb, it says even in Arcadia I am present, and it's a reference to death in paradise, right? So even in the perfect of places. So classical themes being referenced, classical artists being used. So that's what we're seeing in this grand manner style. Opposite of that type of work, though, Lorraine's work, it tells no stories, has no morals, no heroes. Instead, he was interested in the sky and something that was beautiful in the landscape. The landscape actually has more details about it than the humans represented. In fact, the humans and animals are part of it and not the main focus. He studied the outdoors, created a lot of landscapes, and the moods with like sunsets or sunrises are those that he chose for his light sources and preferred. So we're seeing a huge emphasis on landscape art that had never existed before in art history. Callot, another artist, he was interested in showing sort of the miseries of war. He documented the troubled times going on, and his prints were influenced directly by Rembrandt and his etching techniques. What we're seeing here is an image of mass execution of thieves. And these are the very first documents of human disasters and armed conflicts. So he's not making this up. He's sitting there watching this and recording it. Architecture. Bernini, we've mentioned his name before as an influencer. But he was actually originally called up from Italy to come and do this project, but it was too big for him. It was built like a classical temple. There's Greek influence everywhere in its architecture. It's made to show authority, and so we can see that grand manner style once again coming into play in that classical reemergence. There's a great animation on Moodle that I have there for you guys to look at this Versailles. It originally was a hunting lodge that was then turned into a palace, and the forest around it was then turned into a park. It contains a chapel, a grotto, a hall of mirrors, and is very iconic to the Baroque time for the lavishness and money spent on it. It's a symbol of absolute power, and one of those that so much money was spent on it that would later lead to revolution. In England, some of the styles are just the one. So architecturally, we're going to see Sir Christopher Wren, and he's using styles from the French and Italians, and this is built in less than 30 years after the original church. The older Gothic church was destroyed in a fire on the site, and his later influences were on individuals like Thomas Jefferson and such. So we see a lot of his stylistic work in our monuments in Washington.